The movie opens with Ephraim and Thomas taking a boat to a remote island where they'll be working as lighthouse keepers. The day marks the beginning of Ephraim's 4th week term as the assistant keeper of the lighthouse. Ephraim looks around the living quarters attached to the lighthouse, and the house is filled with old decrepit furniture, and the old wooden floors squeak with every step that he takes as he looks around. He goes to the bathroom and sees a hole in one of the mattresses. He then feels around with his fingers and discovers a scrimshaw of a mermaid, which he keeps in his pocket. The next day, Ephraim and Thomas sit at a dinner table and have their meal, and Thomas pours himself and Ephraim a drink, but Ephraim refuses, and Thomas tells him that it's bad luck to turn down a toast, and takes a drink and immediately spits it out. Thomas tells Ephraim his duties, which include emptying chamber pots, maintaining the machinery, carrying kerosene tanks up the stairs, and painting the lighthouse, while Thomas tends to the lantern room. Ephraim tries to remind him that they're supposed to keep watch in alternating shifts, but Thomas immediately shuts down the line of conversation and tells Ephraim to just do as he says. When the night shift starts, Thomas goes to the lighthouse, fully disrobes, and starts his watch while Ephraim goes out for a smoke and walks around the shore. Ephraim then sees what looks to be Thomas's body floating in the ocean among a sea of logs. He walks into the water but sinks, and that's when he sees a mermaid swimming up toward him, making a jarring noise. Ephraim wakes up from what seems to be only a dream, and Thomas tells him that the light needs oil and goes to bed. Ephraim goes around the compound and starts his daily chores, and he fills his wheelbarrow with coal and tries to go back to the storage room, but is stopped by a seagull standing in front of the door looking at him. He tries to scare it away, but the seagull annoyingly refuses to move. He then gets very annoyed and throws one of the coals from the wheelbarrow at the seagull and it flies away. Ephraim takes a drum of kerosene up the stairs, pulling with all his strength until he runs out of breath. He finally makes it up and tries to see the light room for the first time, but Thomas stops him from going up and tells him to never go up there. He gives him a small container of kerosene and tells him to use that next time, ordering him to take back the huge drum of kerosene where he found it. We then see Ephraim and Thomas back at the dining table again having dinner. Thomas tries to get Ephraim to talk, but Ephraim tells him that he's not much of a talker. Thomas tells him that nobody in this job is, and starts talking about how liquor is a sailor's best friend. Finally, Ephraim takes the bait and asks Thomas what happened to his previous keeper, and he tells him that he went mad, raving about mermaids and sea monsters, and then died. He also tells Ephraim that his previous keeper believed the lighthouse was enchanted. Thomas mentions how he saw Ephraim this morning with a seagull, and tells him that it's bad luck to kill a seabird. Ephraim then smacks Thomas in the head when he replies that it's just a tall tale, based on his bizarre superstition that seagulls are reincarnated seamen. When Ephraim goes to bed and tries to read before he sleeps, the same seagull comes knocking on the window as if to taunt him about what just happened. Sleepless, Ephraim goes out again for a smoke, and he looks at the lighthouse and sees a naked figure of Thomas standing idle. Thomas spots him, dresses up, and goes out to the balcony, and Ephraim hides even though he's most probably been seen. The next morning, Thomas tells Ephraim that he's neglected his duties and shows him the markings on the wooden floor. Ephraim tells him that he hasn't cleaned the floors twice today, and they exchange turns into a heated argument, and Thomas warns Ephraim that he'll dock his wage if he contradicts him again. The next day, Ephraim paints the walls of the lighthouse while sitting on a chair strung up by a pulley held up by Thomas. Thomas tells him he's doing important work, but Ephraim replies that nobody's going to see it in the storm. Thomas then lowers the pulley carelessly, and Ephraim tells him to be careful, but Thomas lowers him again, and the ropes give out, causing Ephraim to fall. Ephraim wakes up to a one-eyed seagull from before standing on his leg, and the seagull pecks his leg and tears his trousers, and Ephraim scares it off. While dining, Thomas asks if Ephraim was a lighthouse keeper before, and Ephraim tells him that he was formerly a timberman stationed in Canada. And Thomas reveals that the only lady that he's ever known is deceased. Thomas asks Ephraim why he chose to be a lighthouse keeper after working as a timberman, and Ephraim tells him that since he left that job, he worked all kinds of jobs that would pay a man, and reveals that he landed on the lighthouse keeping when he learned that he could earn good money tending to a lighthouse in remote areas, with the more remote the island, the better the pay. Ephraim has another sleepless night and goes up to the lighthouse, and he hears unintelligible mumbling coming from Thomas and notices a slimy goo sipping down the cracks from upstairs. And finally he sees a long tentacle making its way out of the room and goes back to the room with terror in his eyes. The day before the scheduled departure, Ephraim wakes up and he goes to the kitchen and tries to get a glass of water to drink, but notices that it was murky, so he goes out to investigate and finds a seagull dead in the cistern. He then notices the same one-eyed seagull, and the seagull tries to attack him, and in anger, Ephraim catches the seabird and brutally slaughters it. Thomas tells Ephraim that the wind is drastically changing its direction and warns him that a fierce storm is going to hit the island soon. At night, during their scheduled dinner time, Thomas manages to convince Ephraim to drink, and the men spend the night drinking and singing together, weathering their storm in their cottage. Ephraim asks why Thomas never lets him tend to the light, and the two drunk men get into an argument again, but seeing as how this was the last day for Ephraim, he lets it go and the two men laugh it off. The next morning, as Ephraim empties the chamber pots, he discovers the stranded body of a mermaid, and he gets to his knees and uncovers the beautiful woman that was covered with seaweed all over, and the mermaid wakes up and howls at him, and Ephraim flees back to the cottage terrified to his core. Ephraim and Thomas wait outside, waiting for the boat to come and relieve Ephraim of his watch, but the storm was too heavy and the boat doesn't arrive. Thomas informs Ephraim that the storm has spoiled their rations, but Ephraim is not worried because he thinks that the tender is only a day late, but Thomas states that they've already been stranded for weeks, and the ship will only come for him if they can manage to wait out the storm. After hours, Thomas tells Ephraim that there are rations buried underneath the lighthouse, so the pair go out into the storm to unearth a crate at the base of the lighthouse that Ephraim believes to contain reserve rations, but after they unearth the crate and open it, Ephraim realizes that the crate is only full of alcohol bottles. As the storm continues to rage on, Ephraim and Thomas get drunk every night and alternate between moments of intimacy and hostility. Ephraim expresses how he misses having a steak, and Thomas asks him if he likes his cooking, and Ephraim lets him know that he's not very fond of his cooking. And unfortunately, Thomas takes this comment to heart, and in his very drunk state curses Ephraim, calling the name of the god Neptune. Exhausted and wanting the dragged out monologue Thomas was having to end, Ephraim tells the old man that his food was good and Thomas calms down. One night, while drunk after trying to pick the lock of the lantern room with a knife, Ephraim sneaks back to the bedroom and unsuccessfully tries to steal the lantern room keys from Thomas. Ephraim draws the knife and contemplates murdering Thomas in his sleep, but in that instance, the floor creaks and Thomas wakes up from his sleep, and Ephraim hides the knife quickly. The old man wakes up and notices it was morning, and he tells Ephraim to go back to his daily work. Ephraim comments that Thomas is only tolerable when he's drunk and goes out to work. The next few days, Ephraim works in a daze, thinking of what he had seen previously. He pleasures himself with the scrimshaw in his hand, the image of the mermaid in his mind. Later on, Ephraim goes out to catch lobster, and when he drags out the lobster trap from the sea, he sees the head of a man that used to be Thomas's old assistant. The men spend the next day also in a drunk slumber, drinking and dancing their hearts out. Going from madness to calm, night blends into days as they alternate between peace and bitter conflict, their minds clouded by the intoxicating haze of liquor. One night, while drunk, Ephraim confesses to Thomas that his real name is Thomas Howard, and he tells him that he's assumed the identity of Ephraim Winslow, his cruel foreman in Canada, whom he deliberately allowed to drown as he screams for his name, telling Thomas that it was all he could think about the time he was having a smoke. When he finishes the conversation, Ephraim realizes that Thomas was nowhere to be seen. But from the darkness, he hears Thomas asking him why he confessed what he had done, and Ephraim goes up the stairs, and finally to the balcony of the lantern room, and finds a man lying on the floor, and he turns the man thinking that it was Thomas, but realizes that it was him. Thomas touches him from the back with his eyes shining light on the darkness like a lighthouse. Ephraim runs terrified, and he goes to the docks and gets a small boat, and tries to escape, but Thomas comes out yelling with an axe, telling him that he cannot leave and breaks the small wooden boat apart. Ephraim runs back to the cottage and the old man follows after him, limping with the axe still in his hand. Ephraim closes the door behind him as he gets into the cottage, but Thomas bolts through the door, and Ephraim picks up a chair and tries to safeguard himself from the old man and the axe. He asks him what he's doing, and Thomas accuses Ephraim of abandoning his post and tells him that he'll report him to the inspector. Ephraim tells him how he found Thomas's old assistant in the lobster trap and warns him that he'll tell the inspector what Thomas had done. But Thomas tells him that he has nothing to confess for and states that yesterday's confession has made Ephraim lose his marbles. Then Thomas also claims that it was Ephraim who chased him and hacked up the lifeboat, still clinging to the accusation that it was Ephraim that had gone mad by the confession and not him. But Thomas manages to convince Ephraim that he was going crazy and has him give the knife that he had pocketed earlier. He then goes to say that he will dock Ephraim's pay. With no alcohol left, Howard and Wake begin drinking a concoction of turpentine and honey, and that night a giant wave crashes through the wall of the cottage and floods the entire room. Floating in the water, Ephraim discovers Thomas's logbook, in which Wake has criticized him as a drunk and incompetent employee and recommended he'd be sacked without pay. Feeling angry and betrayed, Ephraim breaks the clock on the wall that was ticking away relentlessly. The two men argue, and Ephraim accuses Thomas of being a liar and hurls an insult at him, and Thomas tells Ephraim that he's relieved of duty, but Ephraim reveals that he's discovered on the logbook that Thomas has accused him of drinking on the job and recommended that he'd be sent away without pay when he made it back. Thomas then taunts Ephraim, mentioning that he killed the seagull and brought this storm upon them. He then goes on to insult Ephraim using the insults Ephraim's old foreman used to hurl at Ephraim, and the two men get into a struggle, and Ephraim attacks Thomas while hallucinating and seeing images of a mermaid. The real Ephraim and Thomas, like a Proteus-like figure, trade blows. Ephraim eventually beats Wake into submission and drags him out of the house, pulling him with a rope across his neck and having him walk on all fours like a dog. Ephraim then takes the old man to the base of the lighthouse where they had dug out the crates previously and starts to bury him alive as he talked. Before losing consciousness, Thomas describes a Promethean punishment that awaits those who look in the lantern. Ephraim then takes the key from Thomas, who's unconscious, and then goes up the stairs to the lantern room, and a few steps up the stairs, Ephraim realizes that he doesn't have his cigarettes with him. Ephraim goes to get the cigarettes, and Thomas returns and strikes him with the axe, and Thomas hits him back and knocks him down, taking the axe and caving in the old man's head. In the lantern room, the lighthouse lens opens to Ephraim, who reaches in and violently screams in distortion before falling down the lighthouse steps. Sometime later, a barely alive Howard lies nude on the rocks with a damaged eye as a flock of gulls peck at his exposed organs. And this is how the movie wraps up. I hope you guys enjoyed the recap. Make sure to leave me a like, leave a comment, also subscribe to my channel. I love you guys so much and I promise to see you on my next recap. Bye!